So you can imagine how Sophie is feeling right now. I mean, she's been kidnapped by a giant. He's taken her somewhere. She has no idea where it is. She doesn't recognize anything about this. And now he's taken her into his cave and has shut the boulder and the cave closed. So here we are. We're down here at the bottom of page 22, where it says Sophie felt herself, okay? Sophie felt herself being lowered to the ground. Then the giant let go of the blanket completely. His footsteps moved away. Sophie sat there, in the dark, shivering with fear. Page 23 now. He is getting ready to eat me, she told herself. He will probably eat me raw, just as I am. Or perhaps he will boil me first. Or he will have me fried. He will drop me like a rasher of bacon into some gigantic frying pan sizzling with fat. A blaze of light suddenly lit up the whole place. Sophie blinked and stared. She saw an enormous cavern with a high, rocky roof. The walls on either side were lined with shelves, and on the shelves there stood row upon row of glass jars. There were jars everywhere. They were piled up in the corners. They filled every nook and cranny of the cave. In the middle of the floor there was a table 12 feet high and a chair to match. So she looks around the room, or around the cave, and she sees that he's got these collections and shelves covered in these glass jars. I wonder what he uses those jars for. The giant took off his black cloak and hung it against the wall. Sophie saw that under the cloak he was wearing all sorts of collarless shirt and a dirty old leather waistcoat that didn't seem to have any buttons. His trousers were faded green and were far too short in the legs. So the word trousers is a fancy word for his pants. On his bare feet, he was wearing a pair of ridiculous sandals that for some reason had holes cut along each side, with a large hole at the end where his toes stuck out. Sophie, crouching on the floor of the cave in her nightie, gazed back at him through the thick steel-rimmed glasses. She was trembling like a leaf in the wind, and a finger of ice was running up and down the length of her spine. "Ha!" shouted the giant, walking forward and rubbing his hands together. "What has us got here?" His booming voice rolled around the walls of the cave like a burst of thunder. Oh boy, it does seem like he's going to eat Sophie. I mean, he was rubbing his hands. He's excited. He's in his cave now. It's very terrifying for Sophie, I'm sure. So here we are now, chapter 5. This is page 25, okay? The BFG. The giant picked up the trembling Sophie with one hand and carried her across the cave and put her on the table. Now he's really going to eat me, Sophie thought. The giant sat down and stared hard at Sophie. He had truly enormous ears. Each one was as big as a wheel of a truck, and seemed to be able to move them inward and outward from his head as he wished. "I is hungry," the giant boomed. He grinned, showing massive square teeth. The teeth were very white and very square, and they sat in his mouth like huge slices of white bread. "Please don't eat me," Sophie stammered. The giant let out a bellow of laughter. "Ha ha! Just because I is a giant, you think I am a man-gobbling cannibal?" he shouted. "You is about right. Giants is all cannibally and murderful, and they does gobble up human beings. We is in giant country now. Giants is everywhere around. Out there us has the famous bone-crunching giant crunches up to wupsly whiffling human beings for supper every night. Noise is ear-busting. Noise of crunching bones goes crackety-crack for miles around." "Ouch!" Sophie said. "Bone-crunching giant only gobbles human beings from turkey," the giant said. "Every night Bone Cruncher is galloping off to Turkey to gobble Turks." Sophie's sense of patriotism was suddenly so bruised by this remark that she became quite angry. "Why Turks?" she blurted out. "What's wrong with the English?" "Bone-crunching giant says Turks is tasted ever so much juicier and more scrumdiddlyumptious. Bone-cruncher says Turkish human beings has a glamourly flavor. He says Turks from Turkey is tasted of turkey." "I suppose they would," Sophie said. "Of course they would," the giant shouted. "Every human being is diddly indifferent.